In choosing a measure of center and spread, it's important to think about whether or not we want this measure to be affected by outliers. If we recall, when we first started talking about measures of center, we had median and mean, and we saw that the median is resistant to outliers, meaning that if you take an outlier out of a data set, it might have some very small effect on the median, but it will have a much larger effect in general on the mean because the formula for the mean takes into account every single data value, whereas the median just makes sure that half of them are less and half of them are more. It doesn't really care how much greater some of those ones that are to the right of the median are. So the median is resistant to outliers. Same thing turns out to be true of the IQR. The interquartile range is just the difference between the third quartile and the first quartile. So again, if we have some outliers, we know, say they're high outliers, we know they're going to be greater than the third quartile, but we don't know how much greater, and we don't necessarily care how much greater for purposes of calculating the IQR. Whereas the formula for standard deviation has a sum of squares of all of those deviations from the mean. So the standard deviation is affected by outliers. So the one that is more influenced by outliers would be this first pair, the mean and the standard deviation. If we want our calculations to be influenced by outliers, those are the ones we choose. If we are interested in calculations that are not influenced by outliers, then we choose the second pair. Another fairly common criterion is if our distribution is bell-shaped. If it's truly bell-shaped, it probably doesn't have any outliers. And so maybe that question wouldn't come up as much. If we have a bell-shaped distribution, the mean and standard deviation are very commonly used to describe the center and the spread. And if we have a heavily skewed distribution, then it's a bit more common to use the median and the IQR. But it's not true that we would choose that every single time that we have a skewed distribution. So I'll say sometimes here because it really does depend on the context. Take, for example, monthly electricity use, which is measured in kilowatt hours. In the city of Austin, the average monthly, and where we say average here, we mean averaged over the months. Just realized that wasn't totally clear because we're talking about an average of averages. So if we average over the months, say like January, February, March, etc. for one customer, then we can get that customer's average monthly electricity use. So then when we say by household, that means that each data value is the average monthly electricity used for that particular household. In Austin, this has some very large outliers. So first we're saying, why would that be true? Let's think about that for a second. Well, a very large outlier would be a customer that uses a lot of energy, right? It wouldn't be a month in which everybody uses a lot of energy because we're talking about this by household averaging over all of the months for each customer. So Michael Dell, for example, lives in Austin, right? Very wealthy, huge house, gotta air condition it in the summertime, gotta heat it in the wintertime, and people with lots of money and very large houses do tend to use lots and lots of energy also. So for the most part, we're gonna say this is the wealthy customers. So wealthy customers may tend on average to use quite a bit more, may use lots of energy. Of course, some of them may also have solar panels and offset some of that, but this is just electricity use. It's not necessarily your net electricity use coming from the city of Austin. So let's just say there are probably a handful of very wealthy people living in Austin that use a lot of energy. Now let's look at these two situations, given that we're already accepting that this is true. A young adult setting up her first account with the City of Austin wants to estimate her electricity usage for financial planning purposes. Which measure of center and spread should she look at? The part I underlined is really the important part. She is interested in her electricity usage. This is a young adult. We're assuming this is not Sandra Bullock moving to Austin, right? This is sort of a typical customer of Austin Energy. She's not really interested in how much energy Michael Dell uses, right? So she would be interested in the median and the IQR because she does not want her calculations to be affected by a few very high outliers. If we contrast that with what would happen when the City of Austin is needing to plan for future electricity plants to accommodate projected growth patterns and make sure there's enough electricity, we can see that the City of Austin is affected by these few people who use large amounts of energy. And so the City of Austin would be more likely to use the mean and standard deviation and say, okay, if I know the mean and standard deviation of this distribution, and I assume that the city is going to keep growing following fairly similar patterns, then I can use those measures to predict with some degree of certainty how much energy I'm going to need to be able to power the city. So the difference here really is that the City of Austin is affected by outliers. The individual setting up her own account and wanting to do her own financial planning is not affected by outliers, so she doesn't want her calculations to be affected by outliers either.